Zen, I seem to be experiencing periodic software crashes when editing my transitions in the Roadway Designer. Am I doing something wrong? What do you think the problem is? Thanks, Koti. Hey Koti, I've personally noticed an increase in software crashes when editing the transitions, and it seems to be corresponding with the V8i and SS1, SS2 versions of Inroads. So when I see crashes in the edit transition tool, my first suspicion is the software, not any specific quarter model settings or the user. You didn't say exactly when the crash happened for you, but it usually crashes right after the transition has been edited in that very first dialog box, and when the secondary edit transition midpoint interface is being exited. Also, I don't think it's a coincidence that these crashes started occurring during the V8i, SS1, SS2 releases, because Bentley made some changes to the template transition zones during the V8i release. If you look at the Inroads README, you'll see these items, among others. Roadway Designer, transition performance was improved. Roadway Designer corridor template drops, transitions no longer reset when synchronizing templates. Roadway Designer corridor template drops, the ability to enable or disable transitions with this dialog box was added. Roadway Designer, the ability to right-click in Plan View and add or delete a transition was added. Roadway Designer, edit transition midpoint, a message was added to inform the user that constraints need to be removed from points that need to transition. Now those are all things that were in the README file that occurred in the SS1, SS2 enhancements. And to me, those are the things that are relevant to this newfound crashing that's happening. I believe that something happened in the Roadway Designer when these changes were made that caused the transitions to experience some kind of periodic instability. And now we just have to learn to live with it, because it's doubtful that anything's ever going to be done to address it now that Roadway Designer has become the focus of the future. So here's what I do now. And I do this every time it happens. And I'll say I cross my fingers every time I click that button to get past that midpoint editing transition. Okay, so just for a little orientation, which you may or may not be aware of, this is directly related to any time you have a template-to-template transition and need of editing. So if you look in the template drops dialog box, you'll see an X where it's under the column to enable transition. It's when you have a particular template that's at a particular station drop and a different one some point later. At the drop on the one later, there's an X. That means that it needs to gradually transform and morph from that one drop earlier to the one later. If you look in the plan view, you'll see a band that has orange lines wherever the drops are, and a yellow or a colored range in there filled that says where that transition zone is. So what happens is when I get either a hard crash, software just closes, or a soft crash, basically the dialog box appears, says something's gone wrong, I do these steps. So this picture here is really the place where the crash usually occurs, during the edit transition midpoint stage. And when you click OK, that's typically when it happens. And the error message usually is something like this that pops up. If it's a hard crash, it could just in a blink of an eye be gone. If it's what I call soft crash, this dialog box is going to come up. So what I just do is, close the software if it hasn't already shut itself down, and just open it back up, open up all your project data again. Now, as a habit, I always try to make the transition edits one more time, just to see if it would work. And sometimes it does. If it works, I smile, feel happy, move on. But it doesn't always. If it crashes again, I'll close it and reopen it, everything. And then what I'll do is I'll go back into that transition area where that color-coded band is. It may be some color. If it's dark, if it's blue, like shown in the graphic here, that actually means that it's was more likely successful and all the connectivity is done. But if it's yellow or light blue, cyan, or red, that means it has to undergo a little bit more editing potentially. So this is where, if you're unsuccessful at that and it's crashing, what I'll do is go in the Roadway Designer, find that transition area in that plan view, and then right click on that plan view and go to delete. What you'll see is that range, color-coded range, will disappear. And then I'll go back to the template drops and basically re-enable that transition. And the way you do that is you go back in and click on the template at the end of that transition under the Enable Transition column, and just basically click in there and it'll place an X at that transition location, and it will recreate that transition. Now, you might think, hey, I could just go in there and uncheck that Enable Transition and then check it again, and it would recreate that. Well, it doesn't. You have to delete the transition, all the connectivity that's in there, whatever else is being stored or saved in there, and then re-enable it to recreate it. So deleting it, to me, theoretically purges it, whereas toggling it on, toggling off doesn't necessarily purge what might be in there. So to really remove it, it has to be deleted from the plan view like it was just described. Then go back in there, find that range, those two transitional template areas, and then basically check that on under the Enable Transition. An X will appear there, and then what you'll see is that transition area again, and then basically go back in, double click on that transition area and cross your fingers and do all the connectivity, get to that transition slider window, and hopefully it moves forward. I wish I really knew more about why that was occurring, but I've never really been able to pinpoint exactly what's going on, which is why I have this workaround. I have a lot of data that does continually crash. These files are XML files. It's very possible that there might be some corruption in there and some way to purge it using XML Spy or some XML editor, but I've never gone that deep into it. I have generally been successful with deleting the transition and recreating it and getting past it. I'll tell you, sometimes it takes a few tries, but generally I can get past it. So in most cases, I've seen that crash happen when it was being re-edited or there was some template changed in that transition, but I've also seen it just in a brand new, fresh, clean transition sometimes happen, which I've seen in a training class. I know that they've just built that, they just dropped those sections, and they went in to try to edit it and it crashed. Now, again, I have some of that information, and someday, if I find the time, I'll diagnose that and see if I could really find out what's going on. But I think software has really moved beyond that, and it's unlikely that, the value of me finding that for others is diminishing. So usually deleting and recreating it eventually gets you through that process. And, because of that, I admit, that I tend to feel like I'm walking on eggshells every time I go through and editing transitions. But I've always been able to get through it. So all I can say is persist, delete it, and recreate it, and hopefully it'll work. If you ever get into a situation where it's just not working, I'd like to see that data. Maybe there's something I could diagnose and uncover. All right, that's it. Civilly yours, Zen.
Audio Jungle.